U.S. If you're one of the 47% of our viewers that are not in the U.S., good evening, good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about a little bit more about diabetes. The CDC, and there's another article we'll cover, which would say, you know what? Maybe we should be doing some victory laps. We're making big improvements in diabetes on a public health basis. Maybe not so much. And we'll try to get into the reality of some of the diabetes, both global and nationwide. We'll try to avoid politics to the extent possible. We'll also talk about some of the clinical information on why those statistics are a challenge. For example, I'll give you a spoiler. One of the big problems is that at the time a lot of these statistics were taken, there was a transition going on from looking at fasting glucose, then transitioning over into using hemoglobin A1C. And the problem is, as multiple authors have acknowledged, hemoglobin A1C is not so good for making a diagnosis of diabetes. It's slower. We're also, as we get into some of that clinical discussion, we're going to cover one article that shows how another reason why so many people, between 20 and 60% of people, already have tissue damage, significant tissue damage like retinopathy, diabetic eye disease, by the time they get the diagnosis of diabetes. In other words, a touch of sugar, be very afraid. Don't just say, okay, I'll go from 2 teaspoons of sugar in my coffee or tea to 1, and that's going to fix the problem. Or I'm going to wait and get focused on this when I really get diabetes. Don't do that. So before we do that, before we get into that topic, just again, as usual, we cover some of the previous topics we've covered. NAD+, I had one of our viewers write me and say he was recently getting into NAD+, and he really enjoyed the article on inflammaging, that new mashup word, and the impact of NAD+ on it. We've had Dr. Kevin McCord on. He's a family practitioner who discovered he had some of his own challenges. When he did, he, in fact, a cardiac event. When he did, he started digging a little bit deeper, looked up our channel, and decided to become a patient. Folks got very interested in what he had to say and asked for a revisit. So he'll be coming back again in a couple of weeks. Again, we've got a lot of other content, got about 1,000 videos available, all for no charge on YouTube. Speaking of diabetes, if there's one thing that we want to accomplish on this channel, it's to create better awareness of undiagnosed prediabetes, and better awareness, as you'll see today, of maybe even diagnosed prediabetes, because it's not just a touch of sugar. So this is one of our webinars on it. It's the most popular one that we have. A lot of people come to us because they had a positive calcium score, or they had an event. In fact, if you put those two together, those are the most common reasons for coming to see us. And, you know, we'd like to move that forward. I'm a prevention doc. I taught that at Johns Hopkins. And rather than wait, and this is secondary and tertiary prevention, keeping problems from happening and keeping problems that have already happened from getting worse. We'd like to help people discover it earlier, before there are problems. We've got a supplements webinar series that we started recently. That's available now as well. For those of you who don't, we are expensive. There's no question about that. As you see, we continue to work on less expensive options if you want to see us as a patient. These are some of those less expensive options, the monthly subscription programs. If you want to know about the core curriculum, the least expensive way to learn, it doesn't give you your own numbers, but like the webinars do, because the webinars actually include your own labs. If you just want to understand it better than your doc and understand where you may need help and where you may need to get a little bit deeper in terms of looking at your own health. This is the core curriculum. It's the insulin resistance course, the plaque course, and the cardiovascular inflammation course. For those of you who want to dig deeper, the Heart Attack and Stroke Prevention Conference covers everything, but it's more like 8 hours worth of videos. The book is continuing. The book has been a saga. It's been a major challenge. Not so much in getting the first draft written, but in getting coordinated between the publisher, the co-author, and we're continuing to get closer. The book is about what a stress test can't tell you. People assume that that it's just the right way to do it. It's the right way to evaluate risk for a heart attack and stroke. And you go to the doc does a Framingham. The Framingham's not a measurement. It's a guess, and a poor guess at that. And then you get, well, let's get a stress test. Well, look it up on Google, and you'll see some of the Google snippets say, from the NIH, say, well, 25 to 30% of stress tests are false positive or false negative. So you really have to ask the question, are you feeling lucky if you want to get a stress test? Tim Russert is maybe the poster boy for that, or was. He started having some problems, went to his doc, passed his stress test with flying colors, and very publicly died at work 3 months later. This whole book is about helping people understand what happened so that you can avoid it for yourself and your family members. We've continued to do work on the website and the podcasts. Just a couple of comments regarding future PrevMed activities. We're currently in discussions to develop a Spanish-speaking channel. There are 50 million Americans that are Spanish-speaking, and not to mention the 47% of our viewers who are outside the U.S. So we're looking to expand in that space. James is heading up a value-based medicine project. We call it the LA project, but LA stands for Lower Alabama. We're working on another project called PESHL, which we can describe a little bit later. And we're looking to expand our own PrevMed care in terms of bringing on some more docs to help with the expanding, increasing demand. We'll continue to do work with K-Health, which is applying artificial intelligence to telemedicine urgent care. MDLIVE, which is one of the lead telemedicine urgent care companies, and Papa, which is looking at applying, it's sort of a gig approach like Uber, but it's family members on demand, family on demand in a gig approach to help your mom or your dad, seniors that need help getting out to get to the doc, need help shopping, just have problems in terms of loneliness. So having a lot of fun working with each of those groups. In terms of prevention news across the world right now, a couple of things have come up recently, one of which we will cover deeply today in the major program, Diabetes Debates. It's like we said earlier, maybe the CDC and maybe some of the research out there would say, maybe we should take some victory laps. Maybe we're starting to chip away at the diabetes problem, both in terms of the nation and the world. And I think we would say, look a little bit deeper at the data and the science. PrEP, pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV infection. You may not know that we're doing some work in that area. That's actually part of the PESHL project. There's big news about PrEP right now. There's a depot form, and it will protect folks for months. Again, those of you who have interest may want to comment, ask questions, or send us questions. CT for lung cancer. Just this week, the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, a group that the first U.S. Preventive Services Task Force happened when I was running the residency program, the postgraduate training program at Johns Hopkins. Our residents developed all of the original background documents for the original recommendations. That has obviously expanded dramatically in the decades since that happened. The most recent information, the most recent news coming out of that group is that CT screening for lung cancer has now dropped from 60 years down to 50 years. So if you're 50 years or older and have a 20-pack year history or greater, you should have a CT. You should be asking about CT scanning for lung cancer. It's similar to a CT calcium score for the heart. It's very interesting process, very interesting procedure. And for the first time ever, after decades upon decades of looking at ways to screen for lung cancer, there are finally some ways that are becoming available. Most of those are now become, from a regulatory perspective, will probably become free. Your insurance company will be required, if you fit that category, to get that. Now, let's get to, this is a sort of a preamble. It's we sometimes do a quick article before we get into the major program. This is a quick article before we go to the major program, but it has to do with this whole issue about statistics and diabetes and a related item. You hear that, you've heard on this channel, between 20 and 60%, depending on which article you're looking at, which investigation, which study you're looking at, between 20 and 60% of people at the time they get the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes already have retinopathy, very serious eye damage. And if you have eye damage, what you may or may not know is that the eye is very much related to the brain. So as Dr. Craig Brown and I were discussing a couple of weeks ago, what goes on in the eye is usually going on in the brain. So retinopathy may be a much bigger deal than even just blindness. Now, I've said from day one, well, most of this 20 to 60% of people that already have eye damage and maybe even therefore brain damage when they get the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, where's that coming from? I've said many times it's because so much of type 2 diabetes is diagnosed way late. Well, there's another reason too. It's not just that. And this is a slide coming out of it. We're not going to go into detail on it, but one thing you can begin to see is this. Retinal damage occurs before the diagnostic criteria for diabetes. So that's 6.5 for hemoglobin A1C. And as you see, this uptick line has already started. If you look at fasting plasma glucose, again, the same thing, 125 or above. Well, diabetic retinopathy has already started before you get to 125 or above. And even that 2-hour plasma glucose, 2 hours after that OGTT test, 200, usually that 1 hour number. If it's 200 or higher, that fits the diagnosis for full-blown diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Again, as you begin looking through these numbers, damage to the eye starts at about 185. So without discussing that any further, we can discuss it, but we're going to go into today's feature program, if you'll give us the water ball. So here's an article from The Lancet. It's a world-recognized medical journal. And they're saying Trends and Incidence of Diagnosed Diabetes, a multi-country analysis of aggregate data from 22 million diagnoses in high-income and middle-income settings. The short version, and we'll talk about it as we go through this, is that they're saying there was actually a couple of, it looked like the new diagnoses of diabetes were slowing down. So again, therefore, maybe a victory lap, or maybe some applause for us as a race in terms of making a little bit of progress against what's clearly the most common disabler and killer in our species. But I think we would say maybe not quite so fast. There's some things that we need to think about in terms of this data. First of all is incidence versus prevalence. Incidence is new cases. Prevalence is the number of people with it. And in a disease like diabetes or prediabetes, where people are living longer and longer and longer with the disease, incidence is often not the major driver of how many people in the world you have with diabetes. The second thing to consider is fasting blood glucose, FBG, versus hemoglobin A1C. As we've covered many times on the channel, A1C is not great for making the diagnosis. In fact, I clearly recommend doing what's called an insulin survey. First of all, you have to challenge the pancreas. A snapshot when you're fasting is just not enough. And that's what a fasting blood glucose is. The other thing is, just looking at glucose alone is not enough. About 10% of the people that I see that have a significant problem, you wouldn't have really known that they had much of a problem if you had looked at glucose alone. Once you begin to look at once you challenge the pancreas with a glucose challenge, and you measure insulin as well as glucose, you begin to see about 10% of these people are still holding their glucose numbers relatively good. But on the other hand, it's taking them twice, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, and 12 times the optimal amount of insulin to keep that blood sugar in control. So again, very few people are doing even an OGTT, just the glucose challenge, let alone actually looking at insulin after a challenge like that. A1C a few years ago began to become the global standard rather than fasting blood glucose. A1C generically has several problems, especially in terms of making that first diagnosis. You see, it's glucose linked permanently to hemoglobin. Hemoglobin's a protein. And that's one of the ways that the diabetes, by the way, does its damage. Glucose in the blood actually links permanently to proteins. I had a teacher in med school who used to carry around a piece of plastic, a plastic model of muscle in his pocket, and he'd pull that out and he would say, "This is what your tissues look like on diabetes." And then people would chuckle or look funny, and he'd say, no, really, this is actually what happens. And he was talking about this fact that glucose bonds permanently to protein and can denature it. It's another example, a very common example of denatured protein is a fried egg. You know, the protein is not denatured until you heat it and fry it. Once you've fried it, it's obviously not going to grow anymore, or it's not a living thing anymore. That's what happens to our tissue on diabetes. Anything that impacts, since it's looking at one specific protein and the glucose binding to that protein, hemoglobin, anything that happens to hemoglobin that causes hemoglobin variation will also cause variation in A1C. For example, pregnancy, which only happens to half our population. We also know that Huge numbers of folks have variations in hemoglobin, a sickle hemoglobin, hemoglobin thalassemia. Several other variations of hemoglobin have arisen in response to pressure from malaria in the tropical areas. Kidney disease, lung disease, and just plain old anemia. All of these things impact hemoglobin. So therefore, looking at hemoglobin is not a great way to diagnose new diabetes. But that hasn't stopped us from doing it. And the author did acknowledge that, you know what, one of the reasons that we're seeing decreased new cases of diabetes is during the time that they were following this, hemoglobin A1C became the standard. There were several places that did not get an increase. And I'll just mention one of them. One of them in the U.S., the one place in the U.S. was the Pacific Northwest. It did not get that decrease that we saw in the rest of the U.S. Now, then they made a good point there. They said, well, there was only one specific group, even within the Pacific Northwest. It was Kaiser Permanente patients. And that is a very telling item as well, because if you are a patient at Kaiser Permanente, you're much less likely to just get a diagnosis based on fasting glucose or A1C. You're much more likely to get true OGTT type of diagnosis. So for a whole bunch of reasons, this is not the good news that you might think. The last item I would caution you to look to is go back to the title. This was only done in high income and middle income settings. Well, the majority of the world is not high income. And guess what? Diabetes is certainly increasing in that space. So we don't think it's quite time for a victory lap in terms of global diabetes. How about diabetes in the U.S.? This comes from another article. This is projection of diabetes burden through 2050. It's a CDC-based article. It was in Diabetes Care. It was a study that aimed to project the number of people with diabetes in the U.S. through 2050. The method used combined age, gender, and race, specific diagnosed diabetes rates, predicted from 1980 to 1998. The information was obtained from the National Health Interview Study in NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Study, which is part of the Bureau of Census. The results, there was an expected increase of 165% of people with the diagnosis of diabetes, going from 11 million in 2000 to 29 million in 2020, a prevalence of 7.2% at that point. 437% increase in men, 271% increase in women. The conclusion was people with diabetes projected 14 million in 2010, 19 or 20 million in 2025, and 23 million in 2020. Elderly greater than 75 years were the most, and minorities were the most affected. Well, here's a CDC comparison to that projection article that we just discussed. It was intended to update the 2017 National Diabetes Statistics Report. It was an analysis of trends in prevalence and incidence estimates over the time. Again, it also used NHANES, the National Institute Health Interview Studies, several other national databases. The results, estimates for 2018, 34.2 million people of all ages had diabetes. That's 10% of the US population. 2.8% of adults and 21.4% of adults with diabetes were not aware. In other words, 1 out of 5 full-blown diabetes patients had no clue. And that's about 3% of the total adult population. So again, you have to ask yourself, if you know you have diabetes, you may actually be the lucky one, because 1 out of 30 My maths, I can't juggle math and presenting at the same time, but yeah, I think it's about 1 out of 30 adults have diabetes and don't know it. And of the adults that have diabetes, 1 in 4 don't know it. So, and those numbers are very consistent with what I see in terms of my own practice. Prevalence trends, 9.5% from 99 to 2002, and 12% from 2013 to 2016. So, highest prevalence groups, as we mentioned, time and time again, among minorities, Indian, Alaska Natives, 15%, Hispanic, 12.5%, and non-Hispanic Black, 11.7%. And as we all know, higher among 45 to 64-year-olds. Median county level prevalence was 8% in 2004 and 13% in 2016. So that's looking at that map. If you look at that map and begin to realize that's diabetes spreading in our country. And guess what? None of this has been about prediabetes. And as we've mentioned multiple times, you get that tissue damage with prediabetes, including risk for heart attack and stroke. So that's the basic presentation for today's program. I'm going to close that part out, and we will start talking about what you guys want to talk about. Deal with some questions. James, have you had a chance to look at some of the questions as they're coming up?
Hey, good morning, Dr. Brewer.
Good morning, James. You've been able to take a look at some of the questions as they're coming up?
We haven't picked up a lot of questions around diabetes yet. As we go through them, you'll see a few questions sprinkling in. Most of it's just good morning, and we have a good mix of international watchers and listeners this morning. So welcome to people all over the world. These studies do demonstrate that diabetes is a growing international issue. I think I read in all of this research, China still remains the fastest growing. Asia is the fastest growing area of diabetes, both in China and India. It's another study, the rate of growth in diabetes in people who live in the United States with an Indian, South Asian heritage is one of the most rapidly growing populations of people struggling with diabetes. And so I'm sure there's some underlying genetic interesting facts. We don't know, we can't speak to all of them, but the change between habits and lifestyle of moving to the West versus having a genetic profile from Southern Asia and how that impacts the disease such as diabetes. But a really good job. Enjoyed this topic and study, and we'll maybe make some commentary and talk about the math on these studies as we've discussed offline.
Will do. I see, as often happens, Robert Weiss from the North Georgia Mountains started the comments off. Good to talk to you, Robert. In fact, you started a little bit before time, 15 minutes ahead. How do you know and measure if your pancreas is recovering and able to create more insulin without stressing? I have a 0.65 triglyceride over HDL. That is very, very good. Max 50 carbs per day, I bet. And most days you're probably not hitting 50 carbs, at least 50 glycemic carbs with a triglyceride over HDL ratio less than 1 like yours. And so far less than 1. Walk at least 6 miles per day. That is a big help as well. And 1,000 calories per day. BMI 22.5, watching weight very carefully. So now I don't know any way that you can quantify the improvement. You are probably getting some improvement. As we covered, a few months ago, we used to not know science-wise, is this a problem? Is the decreased insulin function? We know the original problem in type 1 is that there appears to be usually a cross-reactivity where your own immune cell attacks your pancreas and knocks out your ability to make insulin. with the vast majority of us, 90% of us that have type 2 diabetes, it's the other way around. Our insulin receptors just get old and sticky and don't respond. They get resistant to insulin. Now, one thing we've not known until very recently is, what about putting that pancreas at rest, just like you've done, Robert, going down to very few carbs per day, not challenging it on a regular basis. What's the problem at that point? Is it that we lose islet cells, beta cells in the pancreas, or are they just getting tired and worn out? Well, the information became clear about a year ago. It's the beta cells are not getting wiped out. They're just getting worn out. So people have said many times before, you can actually rest that pancreas and start getting some of that function back. We see it. We see it happen a lot of the times. In fact, it's not uncommon at all for me to see a new patient coming to the channel who's got significant plaque, but then doesn't have much of a problem with the OGTT. Not that would support that amount of plaque. But I've learned from seeing these kind of patients to ask, have you lost a lot of weight over the past few years? I hear it time and time and time again. Yeah, doc, I lost about 30 pounds. I lost 50 pounds. And as David Murphy shared, he lost over 150. So all that extra weight stresses your insulin resistance. Now, your question, to get back to your question, yeah, you can improve this by giving it a rest, losing that body fat, and decreasing the daily carbs. I do not know how to get a quantification without doing an OGTT, or preferably that insulin survey. James, any comments on that?
Well, you could, practically. Why wouldn't? And I'm asking you this question. Correct me if you would. But why wouldn't Robert order 2 kits, mini OGTT kits? So let's suppose that he gets two or three dry blood spot cards, the ADX 100 type, with the serum separation, where you get insulin and glucose from it. And he wouldn't have to do the full 3 hours, would he? Let's suppose that he fasted for 8 to 16 hours. And on day 1, took an insulin and a fasting glucose, long fasting glucose, and then waited 30 days. So we look at, if the insulin, look at it after fast, let me clarify, fast, and then challenge after the fast and test the 1 hour, the baseline in the 1 hour, right? So you baseline 1 hour insulin and OGTT. You wouldn't necessarily need 2 hours or 3 cards because you're not trying to graph it. And then 30 days later, do the exact same thing and just see over that 30 days if you've been very disciplined, if you've continued to lose weight or keep your weight down and have rested your pancreas consistently. For that matter, you could also add in a CGM to make sure that you're keeping your blood sugar levels, let's say, below 100, and then look after 30 days and see if the same amount of insulin is required or less insulin is required in order to maintain the same level after an hour. Just make sure the 2 tests over 30 days or whatever distance would be the same. Would that not give you some insight as to the effort that the pancreas has to call upon the beta cells to do that?
There's no question. I think it would. And I think what we're struggling over here is the term without stressing.
Right.
And so to me, that's doing a version of a stress test that you're talking about. You brought up another item, which I started to go into, but I go down so many bunny holes. Sometimes I confuse myself and get lost. I'll go down that bunny hole now. Of course, just following, getting a CGM, continuous glucose monitor, and following that, you can see improved patterns in your own ability to manage glucose just from following your continuous glucose management. Now, that does not involve an intentional stress. And what I'm referring to when I say stressing the pancreas is I'm talking about doing some sort of pancreatic stress test, fasting, getting a fasting insulin and glucose, and then stressing it with 75 or 100 grams of glucose, and then seeing what happens to your blood glucose and insulin levels at that point of over an hour and then 2 hours afterwards.
Correct.
So Bambi Grage, good morning, Bambi. I was just looking at one of your videos this morning where you had shared some questions about K2. Good morning, Bart, Martha. How's your nephew looking this morning, Aunt Martha?
Looking good.
Big SMR. Good morning from rainy Southern California. I thought they said it never rains in Southern California.
Nor does earthquakes or fires or this or traffic. It's perfect. It's a wonderful place.
My very first trip to LA, it was when we were doing the HIV seroprevalence project. One of the participating groups was the LA County Jail. Big operation. Our goal was to do a seroprevalence of HIV. This was back when HIV was just spreading. It was over 20 years ago. And I remember the medical director saying, yeah, we'll participate and it'll take us a few hours to get 1,000 blood studies. Amazing. So huge turnover at the LA County Jail. It's not the jail. There are dozens of jail facilities there in that system. But anyway, we were there for about a week, getting things set up, meeting with other folks. Every day it rained. So you do get rain in LA, but it's just not that often.
Yeah, you get June gloom. I've been out there in June, and it's just the fog roll in. It was cool, and you scratch your head and say, "Well, it should be warm." So I've been there when the weather's not been perfect. Most of the time, weather's really nice.
T. Smith, good morning from Houston. I don't remember that name. I do remember the next one, Amir Al Gayer from Germany, and obviously Aunt Martha. Which number do I count? How much folate I'm getting? She
just to clarify later, a couple of comments down, she evidently is reading whichever bottle of folate she's taking, and there's in parentheses 600 mcg and then 1,000. I suspect that the dosage is at the 1,000. If you're reading your label, most of those bottles are not allowed by the proprietary product to put more than 1,000, which is 1 gram per pill. So if you want to get more than 1,000, you either have to have a medical food, which is what Ocufolin was that Dr. Brown spoke about last week, or you have to take more than one of them. Take 2, 3 of them. I take 2, but if you take Ocufolin, but I take Restore Me. I don't take Ocufolin. If you take Ocufolin, you can get a higher dose in it. But just count the 1, I think, for it is what she's looking for.
So what do you get with Restore Me?
Restore Me, I think he talked about it some last week. You get 1. You get 1,000 or 1 gram, 1,000 mcg.
Very good. Thank you, James. Parker Reed, good morning from North Texas. Question, did you say your book will cover your diet recommendations along with testing, et cetera? We go into depth on testing. And the short, well, maybe not a short answer, but you asked for it. The typical testing protocol that you've seen in the US has been Framingham, which is not a measurement, it's a guess and a bad one, to Framingham, to a stress test, to a cardiac cath, into the cath lab. There's all kinds of reasons that is the wrong way to go. And we do give you 3 other options, all of which are far better. The CIMT, the calcium score, and the CT angiogram. So not going to get much deeper into that right now, but that's what that book is about. It really does not cover the major cause, insulin resistance, prediabetes, and diabetes. But that would have made a 150-page book more like 1,000 pages. So we hope to be working on that book a little bit later, but we've got videos on it. Martha, how do I count the amount? Okay, well, that's what we talked about earlier. Simra Bachevan, good morning from the Netherlands. Good morning to you as well, and thank you for joining us from there. I don't remember seeing someone from the Netherlands yet. Vicky SMR, Dr. Brewer, would you allow your patient to simply consume an equivalent of 50 grams or 75 grams of glucose in common foods instead of drinking that standard glucose liquid? Well, I mean, the patient makes their own decision. What could I tell from it? I'll give you an example. I did a video a couple of years ago using Mott's applesauce. There were 2 points to that video. The first one is this thing that everybody thinks, oh, applesauce is a fruit. It's going to be good for you. Well, applesauce is full of sugar. And guess what? Mott's applesauce, which everybody gives to their kids as the 4th or 5th snack or meal of the day, in addition to the fructose, the sugar that is already in the apples, they add sugar to it. And guess what? When I had my Mott's applesauce, I took my glucose before. I think it was one hour afterwards and 2 hours afterwards. May have done it at half an hour. But guess what my blood sugar did? Any guesses, James?
Oh, it went straight up. I watched the video. It's cheating.
Oh, okay. Sky high. So short answer is yes. People do that all the time.
But you probably wouldn't recommend trying to calculate a meal and figure out some combination between vegetables and potatoes and eat. And then because of the digestive rates, if it's a food like an applesauce to get to an OGTT, but it wouldn't be a combination of meals because trying to calculate the glycemic effect of a sweet potato versus a white potato and how many grams that is and how many hours. If you're actually running OGTT, I think our question is, if someone did want to drink the glucola, is there a food substitute? But would you speak to that?
Thank you for bringing that up. And I think that is the real question. Of course, you can tell if somebody's having a problem, especially with a food like applesauce, which it's almost a liquid. But James brought up a really good point. I mean, you start getting into things like sweet potatoes, other things like that. The glycemic value might be high, but it might take them, especially mixed with other foods, a while to be digested. So you really have, and so if you're going to start mixing glycemic variations in glycemic value with it, you're clearly not going to get something that's comparable.
And that Kraft insulin score, or the OGT, is to create the chart. They may not be seeing the chart, but it's really imperative to look at the 3 values and to see, the value of the fasting, the value of the challenge, and then the insulin response. And those responses, different foods have different response to different people. And as to where that liquid effect of just the high sugar is really what we're trying to accomplish. So I would think that their concern may be they don't want to drink the glucola. It is god awful. I mean, that I don't blame them. But your point is there are other things. If they're concerned about the glaucoma, a large Coke will accomplish what they're wanting to accomplish. A large orange juice, cranberry juice mixed with vodka. It works. I mean, you can make that work. Enough cranberry juice. If someone really fights it, that 3rd hour, you might also want to do a breathalyzer. But it's some juice like that.
Unless you're on a very low carb diet or a keto diet, you're stressing your pancreas on a regular basis anyway. You can get a finger stick glucometer and just start checking your blood sugars after you go to McDonald's or after you eat regular food. And the optimum is to not get above 120. Once you start getting above that, you're clearly starting to get into a suboptimal area. So speaking of OGTTs, Bambi's asking, how do you repeat the OGTT, or how often? I recommend it once a year, especially as we start getting past age 50. That's when we start aging. Those insulin receptors start getting a little bit rusty. And anytime you have a 10-pound or more weight loss or 5% of your body fat or 5% of your body weight change, because changing body fat has a huge impact on insulin resistance. Getting a lot of questions that sort of popped up there. I hope I didn't skip one. T. Smith, having great difficulty keeping my weight on with the low carb diet. I have kept since attending your Orlando conference. Well, thank you so much. In February 2020, my BMI is now about 19. Any tips? Two things. The first thing, number one, again, thank you for sharing that. Actually, maybe three things. The first one is, I know that people are telling you look sick. Our culture, it has gotten very Rubenesque in terms of our taste. James, you want to make any comments about my terminology there?
We talked about this earlier this morning, that there is a cultural impact that's beginning to want to adopt obesity and call it beautiful. Well, a person can be beautiful no matter their weight size. A person is beautiful from the inside out. Healthy is what we're concerned about. And it's unhealthy to be overweight. And when you get to your normal, how we should operate. I watched a show here recently, Ford, of a group of family that they all committed to live 1 year as pioneers, live in the modern age as if they would have lived, give up, basically become like Amish. And the one thing that they noticed, that the entire family's weight loss was significant, not because they were working outside and their diets changed. And the wives commented on there, my husband looks like a skeleton. But we went back and looked, and the average weight of a man in the 1840s, the 1850s, 1870s, 1880s, if you go that entire 19th century, the average man only weighed about 140, 145 pounds. In fact, the military would not allow you to join the cavalry if you weighed more than 150 pounds. And so it wasn't all for short people. That is what we should look like, skinny people, but our perception has just changed dramatically. So 19 is nothing to complain about. Build more muscle mass may be part of the solution, is do more resistance training. I know that has a little J-curve effect potentially, but if you're already at 19, look at building more muscle, and that may impact what you're trying to accomplish.
As we get past, she shares later in the next one, female 66 years old. As we get past our 60s, or as we start getting into our 60s, especially you start to get a significant increase in curve in the mid 60s where we lose muscle mass.
Right.
And that is a really, really big deal in terms of increasing cardiovascular risk. And guess what? It's also a really big deal in terms of insulin resistance and prediabetes and progression. So I would agree with James. I'd make three comments. You asked about tips. The first one is resistance training. If you can continue to focus on building muscle mass. And the biggest place to build muscle mass, when you say muscle mass to women or to men in weightlifting, they always they're thinking about their arms. Even if you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, your big muscle mass is not in your arms. It's in your legs. So they've done studies where they look at mitochondria mass within muscles, and it wasn't walking that helped that. It was high intensity interval training and resistance training. So both of those are very important. The second thing I would say is that just portion control. Most people like myself have problems keeping portions down. Some people have problems keeping portions up. And here's the thing. People think that it's a very common, like urban myth. Well, if you're keto, you can eat all you want and you'll still lose weight, or you'll never gain weight. Well, maybe all you want. That depends on how you term all you want. If you're somebody that grew up in the deep South like me, with a major set of bad language around food, bad culture around food, I can't eat all I want. I will gain weight like nobody's business because I'll eat a whole lot and I'll eat it often. The reality is you can't eat 6,000 calories and not gain weight on keto. So you may not want that food, but you can certainly gain weight on keto. In fact, there's been, as you might imagine, there's been science around that. A lot of it done recently by a fellow named, Ludwig, David Ludwig. He's an endocrinologist at Harvard. He runs the Harvard obesity program. And there's a small subset of humans that on keto will burn at a 30% decrease in efficiency on keto. That's as big as it gets, and that's only about 10% of us. The vast majority of us do burn with less efficiency on keto, but like 10%. So if you're one of those, so what that means is this: if you're one of those people, like 90% of us that have a 10% inefficiency on that burn, add 10% to what you're used to eating. It doesn't have to be carbs. It can still be keto, and you're going to put and you'll maintain weight, and just add another 10% and you'll start putting weight back on. If you're one of those unusual, the 10% of us that actually can burn keto at a 30% deficiency, you got to eat a third again of what you're normally eating to maintain your weight, and obviously again more than that to gain weight. Any other comments, James, before we move on?
Nope, but I just imagine that there's good luck to you, Miss Smith, but the rest of the female listeners on this channel are going, what?
I know. It's very interesting. As you've met Janice, and many of you on the channel have seen Janice, my wife. She works with PrevMed, has 2 doctorates and a lot of background in terms of health coaching and teaching. She has, for genetic reasons, which I can't discuss because I've been forbidden to, she's got some genetic reasons for being thin. And her BMI has always stayed in the low 20s and high teens. And you're exactly right, James. She gets it from other women, just a lot of jealousy there. A lot of jealousy with me too. I will have to say, despite all of that training, despite all of that education, and despite the fact that her and her family of origin BMIs tend to hang around the high teens, low 20s, when my BMI goes from 24, 23 down to 20 and 21, guess what Janice starts saying to me? You look sick. People are just not used to a healthy body weight. Robert Weiss lost 100 pounds 4 years ago. Robert, you made you probably added 3 or 4 decades of non-disabled life, barring getting hit by a bus or something like that.
COVID.
Oh boy, I don't know if we want to go there. Atif Aslam Siddiqui started taking OBX, anti-angiogenesis, for visceral fat in its 5th week, hoping to get my diabetes reversed in case it's an insulin resistance. Well, thanks for sharing that. I haven't heard of OBX. But the angiogenesis, I will say, there's a lot of focus around that. As Dr. Brown mentioned last week, one of the major problems with retinopathy is blood vessels, genesis, creating new blood vessels. There's a lot of challenge around that space. The same thing happens with unhealthy fat versus healthy fat. The unhealthy fat has some problems with the vasculature. We don't understand that completely yet, and I'm not aware of any supplement that at this point that has a proven benefit. Tremendous job, Robert. Congratulations. I would agree. 100 pounds is a very, very big deal. Vicky, why would we want to stress our pancreas with 75 to 100 grams of pure glucose if that's not a common form of a carbohydrate sugar we'd normally consume during a meal? Well, Vicky, you are one of one of the very few members of the human race that evidently understands the problem associated with glucose. I think that's the short answer I would have on that. Most of them don't. I mean, this typical American diet: go to McDonald's and get a large Coke, and as James said, 76 grams of glucose right there in a McDonald's large Coke. How many large Cokes do you think McDonald's sells? And how many people do you think have more than one per day?
I think she's making a different point, Ford.
Okay.
I think she's challenging your glucose challenge, because earlier, if you look at her comments, she was the one that requested can we just get to the glucose challenge test using a meal? And at first is saying, well, you can use glucola, use apple juice. So I think you would clarify and say it's not that we want to. So that the key word there is want. In trying to diagnose and understand what's happening with the person, we present the challenge. It's not ideal, but it's the most effective, efficient way to measure, and there's no additional harm, I think you would say. I'm putting words in your mouth. Eating a meal that creates that pancreas challenge, or drinking glucose that creates that pancreas challenge. We really don't wake up and want a challenge, which is why I think the earlier gentleman was Bart, I think it was saying he didn't want to create the stress, but that's why you only recommend it once a year. It's not that we wake up and go, let's challenge our insulin. The pancreas is not like building your heart muscle up. It's not a great thing, but it seems to be the only way right now that we can really get a picture through an insulin Kraft score to diagnose diabetes appropriately.
Thank you, James. I think you're right. So the whole point here, if you go back to the original main program we were talking, there are how many millions of people that don't know they cannot metabolize glucose well. And since they don't know that, they don't watch their carbs on a daily basis. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get people to recognize how many, all of those people that have prediabetes and even full-blown diabetes and have no clue. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to give them a warning that they're damaging themselves with these daily glucose challenges they're doing. I hope that helps. Mm-hmm. Aunt Martha, James, she wants a clinic in her area.
Well, just come visit. We should just come down to the coast and visit one of those clinics and stay at the beach and see you. We can just do that.
We would obviously love to grow the footprint, but that's a few years down the road. Saeed Ali, evening, everyone. Yeah, right. So for some people, it's not the morning, as we said. Parker Reed, at Martha Reich, Tupelo, love the town, home of Elvis. Yes, it is. When I was working with Toyota when they started the plant down there, and had a couple of fun trips down there getting it started. The stuff I drank for the glucose test didn't taste that bad, like Tang. After you've gone on a keto diet and if you've been addicted to sweets like I have been, and then had to break that addiction, it's a challenge for a lot of people to drink that stuff. Any comments, James?
I would. I'll pick on my aunt. I love her. She's wonderful. She grew up with my wonderful, beloved grandmother cooking. Her taste buds are wasted anyway. Everyone else has that grandma that cooks good. My grandmother was a health nut, and I don't mean nut in a negative way. My grandmother was very health minded, and she put it in her cooking in her last 20 to 30 years, at least, of her life. And Martha's judgment of good taste tasting food may be skewed a little bit. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I'll let you and Aunt Martha sort that out. BJJ, we haven't heard from you. I think your comments were very popular last month on the channel, and I think you were going to come on and talk about something else with us when you get a chance. BJJ saying he recently started white tea. He's seen some improvement in his post-meal glucose, postprandial blood glucose. It seems to correlate. Turns out there's literature or some science to support this. I would agree there is some science. And I do drink. I drink white tea. I drink green tea, which has some evidence behind it as well. And there's a lot of supplements that have some evidence, like cinnamon, berberine, bergamot. Any comments, James, about the supplements area?
I've seen the same thing, seen the same studies around tea. It's interesting when you travel to Eastern Europe and Asia, where there is and was historically lots of tea drinking, lots of dark teas, white teas drank, that, you do see that people are healthier, skinnier on average, at least they were 20, 30 years ago when we travel. I think there's a correlation there. I don't know to what effect.
So this is an interesting one for me. Steve Mitchum. Arnold was asked if he could only do one exercise for the rest of his life, what would that be? And he answered, squats. I wonder which Arnold you're talking about, Steve.
Arnold Schwarzenegger.
And I would agree. If there's one exercise that will help you build muscle, it's squats. Another thing that you find out if you read a little bit of the bodybuilding literature and talk to some bodybuilders, there's a saying that if you want to build your upper body, you work on your lower body. And their point behind that is they've discovered that the hard way. Their point behind that is that you create much more of a metabolism if you're working these big muscles. Now, a lot of my patients have knee problems and can't do that. Some of them are able to do lunges, which I tend to do. A lot of our group, a lot of our viewers are middle-aged men who love to do cycling, road cycling, women as well. Cycling in and of itself is great because it has that high intensity intervals. It has prolonged use, and it's really working on those big muscles. If you could just stay out from under cars, and folks that are doing it again indoors can do just that.
That's why I focus on jumping to conclusions. That's my exercise for my lower extremity.
BJJ, hit the like, folks. Thank you, BJJ. Pound the button, the like button there. Thank you, Bart. Jeff Tier. Do you look at ferritin? We do, yes. So what Jeff is talking about is iron levels in the blood can be inflammatory, create cardiovascular inflammation as well. Josefina Lopez, is there a correlation with high insulin and autoimmune conditions? I'm not prepared to make a statement about that. James, how about you?
I wouldn't shock me, but there's no evidence, so we're careful to comment on that type of specificity publicly when there's I don't know of any literature.
I can't resist but to say this, Josefina. If you look at insulin and insulin-related problems, that appears to be about 80% of cardiovascular inflammation, heart attack, and stroke risk. But of that other 20%, autoimmune conditions are really big. So, for example, most people know that type 2 diabetes causes heart attack and stroke risk. Most people don't know that rheumatoid arthritis, if you have it, causes as much risk as type 2 diabetes. So yes, these autoimmune conditions are a very big deal. So as you can imagine, given what I do for a living, I've got a lot of patients that have psoriatic arthritis, which is an autoimmune arthritis, have inflammatory bowel disease. A lot of people, even before this whole issue of inflammation and heart attack and stroke risk became known, it was always known that thyroid problems were a major risk factor for heart attack and stroke, one of the more common ones. And guess what? The vast majority of thyroid problems start off as an inflammatory condition of the thyroid. Any other comments before we move on?
Certainly diet. We know something in the autoimmune system is often triggered by diet. And so both diabetes, I don't know diabetes is creating autoimmune, but certainly some of those triggers and some of those conditions are lifestyle and diet.
Yes, no question. There's a major relationship there, but I don't know that there's been any causality proven back and forth. Decap asked, what is white tea? It's a type of tea. You can look it up on Amazon. You can look it up on the internet. It's a very light colored tea. Josefina, my sister has lupus-like condition managed with chemo. I believe I'm on the same path, but I've noticed I'm managing with decreasing my carbs. Well, so here's one of the things, Josefina. Both of them cause cardiovascular inflammation. Lupus causes cardiovascular inflammation, and increased carbs and insulin cause cardiovascular inflammation. So if you have both of those going on, and that's the issue with so many of my patients, they have both inflammatory reasons, and then they start hitting their 50s, and then they start getting insulin resistance. Then they've got not one, but two major causes of cardiovascular inflammation. These people are at significant risk for heart attack and stroke. And just managing one of them makes a big deal. So typically, with these patients, what you'll see is their rheumatologist following their C-reactive protein for their arthritis, their inflammatory arthritis, and me following that and a bunch of other things for cardiovascular arthritis. The rheumatologist is working with things like methotrexate, and I'm working with things like lifestyle. Ben Yeoman, 63-year-old male, mother, grandmother, uncle, aunts, and cousins all have diabetes. No doc ever said I should pay attention to diet. Isn't that frustrating? Aunt Martha says she's going to see you on March 25th at the coast.
Yeah, come on down. She's buying.
There you go. Ben Yeoman, apple cider vinegar always blunts my postprandial numbers significantly. It will. You hear a lot of these things, and they sound like urban myths. Apple cider vinegar being one of them. Well, apple cider vinegar actually impacts the acidity of the stomach and slows the stomach down from emptying. So it was like what James and Vicky were talking about a few minutes ago. You change the glycemic value, and that has a big impact on the numbers that come out and when they come out. Vicky, again, it'd be nice to have PrevMed clinic in Southern California. You would be busy, Doc. I've got a lot of patients in Southern California, Vicky, whole lot. San Diego, LA, several other places in Southern California. One more question. If you're experiencing, notice that your patients that adhere to low carb diet, which would positively affect their glucose numbers, has adverse effects on their cholesterol numbers. Here's a known thing, T. Smith. In some patients, it's not very common, but it is seen. And you'll see this on Dave. Do you remember Dave? What's his name's last name, James? He's the fellow on the internet that talks about lean mass hyperresponder.
No, sir.
Usually you get improvements in cholesterol values as well, T. Smith, especially with the most important cholesterol findings, and that is the triglyceride over HDL ratio. You get definite improvements there. But LDL is what a lot of people are talking about. Some people can get a significant increase in LDL associated with it. The vast majority of them don't get an increase in small, dense, the dangerous LDL. They get increases in the healthy LDL. Great question. Thanks for asking. At what point in terms of labs would you suggest your patient to decrease or get off the diabetes meds and replace it with supplements or diet therapy? We get people off of blood pressure meds. We get people off of diabetes meds. And it happens when you start getting some really good numbers. I can't give you cut points, but I will tell you, for example, with blood pressure, I had I had a patient who lost 40 pounds, and he started getting dizzy when he would bend down. And sure enough, we had to take him off a couple of his blood pressure pills. Mezzanine, can you speak to the effects of poor sleep on blood sugar, particularly fasting levels after a poor night's sleep? Absolutely. What you see, increased fasting glucose levels, and you see increased insulin resistance after poor sleep. And this has been done with sleep labs where patients did not even notice that they were having poor sleep. They were able to document it using the EEG, and they found increased insulin resistance for the next 48 hours. So many of us have sleep problems as we get older. We just don't sleep like a baby anymore. And you get increased cortisol and some other things which we don't understand. You get decreased healing, decreased hormonal replenishment, but you get insulin resistant. So there's nothing like a good night's sleep to help. When you hear something's an important risk factor for heart disease, I was wondering how many independent risk factors for heart disease are there? Well, gosh, I do not know.
You know, in Amy Doneen's book and Brad Namie's book, they go through a lot of those lists. So if someone has that book, Beat the Heart Attack Gene, I think they go through things, a lot of those independent, like Frank's disease and things that are obscure that people may not be aware of. So that's a good reference. I've never thought to count them, but I know there's surprisingly a lot of problem. Yeah.
Gout.
Yeah.
Badar Khan, operation treatment possible. Didn't quite understand that. Dave Feldman. Thank you, Steve Mitchum. It's Dave Feldman. The Shumby, Feldman, Dave Feldman. Yep. So I agree with most of what Feldman talks about, including I have to talk a lot of my patients down out of a tree, out of a level of concern because they go keto. And again, some of them will start getting a significant increase in their LDL. If their doctor doesn't understand that, the doctor gets really nervous and starts heightening the anxiety. The one thing that I don't fully agree with Dave on is the thing about he makes a statement that lean mass hyperresponders are not FH patients. FH stands for familial hypercholesterolemia. And here's the thing. Lean mass hyperresponder is not the same thing for a lot of FH, but it clearly is for some of them. You see, there are over 2,000 different SNPs or genetic variations for FH. And we're fortunate to have a fellow who started his own human genetics lab and went way deep into that. So, James, you want to give any comments about?
I agree with you. The obviously there's a difference between correlation and causation, and the genetic impact is almost always the most primal cause of FH. As we studied it, you can aggregate the effects of it, but you can be lean, you can be fat, but for some of those SNPs, they're significant. Just like the PCSK9s and others are for heart disease as well. Some things you can impact and help, but you can't run from how you're made. So
thanks. Bart Robinson, just like most of the rest of us, the gym's closed and now we're having to figure out what to do for working out. I have some dumbbells. I have 5, 10, 15, 25, 30, 40, and 50-pound dumbbells. And I'll do a lot of squats with those, a lot of lunges, and those make a big difference. Bart says he's doing his with 5-gallon water jugs, and it definitely feels heavier than that. And it helps. I have no doubt that it does, Bart. I get all these people that say, well, my gym's closed and I can't do anything. Oh, that's not true. All you have to have is an empty milk jug and a faucet that works. Thank you, Bart. Any comments, James?
Oh, I think 5 gallons of water is 8 pounds. if I recall. So 2 of those gives you 2 8-pound weights with a handle. The square cartons may be a little more difficult to hold. If you get the handle on them, that's 8 pounds each.
One of the things you have to remember is the number of reps. So
even the form, that, as it's just not the lifting, it's the form, it's the static hold and engaging your lower. So if you're going to do squats, you also could just engage with your arms while you're braced, while you are squatting, and just trying to hold those forms will create those micro tears that you're trying to accomplish. So there are lots of videos to watch on this all over the internet, but it's form, not just function.
No question. The other thing I would say is that it's reps. I can't do a good Arnold Schwarzenegger, but one of his quotes is reps, reps, reps. I've spent my whole life doing reps. I'm sick of reps. And he's obviously going to continue doing it. And that's the thing. Most people think, oh, well, I do 8 reps of curls with my arms and 12 reps of squats and I'm good. No, you're not. Well, okay, I do 3 sets of each. You're still not good. I mean, you need to start working on things like 100 reps, 60 to 100 reps. That's when you start getting that burn in those muscles. And if you think you're going to, if you think 5, 10, 15, 25 pounds in each hand is not very much, get up to 100 reps and see how that feels. Anita, my husband has higher GS around 105 in the morning after fasting and lower during the day. How can the liver be reset to normal gluconeogenesis levels? People get really wrapped up and worried about the dawn effect, and that's what you're describing here. A glucose of 110, 105 is not going to be causing damage. It's really the glucose values 110 and especially 140 and above that cause the damage. We could spend 20 minutes talking about ways to deal with and manage that AM spike that about 20% of us have. But for the most part, the most common advice I have is don't worry about it unless it's like 120, 125. George Borb, FH and insulin sensitivity, how important? They're critical. I mean, you're born with the FH, but when you get 50, you start adding that insulin sensitivity. I mean, we talked several times about the number of different risk factors. There are a lot of different risk factors. Why is it that we start to have heart attacks and strokes in our 50s and 60s? Because of insulin resistance. So families that have FH, they've had high cholesterols their whole lives. It didn't kill them in their 20s, unless they had homozygous FH, which we won't get into, but it's an incredibly intense version of this. They start having their heart attacks in their 50s and 60s, and it's because insulin resistance has dogpiled the other risk factors. James, any problem with me using the politically incorrect term dogpile?
No, sir.
Mezzanine, LDL 61, HDL 63. That's some good numbers there. Triglycerides 39. Wow. So your triglyceride over HDL is about a half, just over a half. Fasting glucose is elevated from 80s to 96. That's minimal. I tell you what, there's a whole lot of people, Mezzanine, that are going to be jealous of your numbers, including that fasting glucose. A whole lot of people would say that's not elevation at all. Low carb diet, exercise and supplements, but terrible sleep. It's a struggle. It can be a struggle. Chuck K, 1 gallon of water is 8 pounds. 5 gallons is 40 pounds.
Yeah, we made a mistake. You and I were both talking about milk jugs. If you go back and read the comment, he did say 5 gallons. So that'd be correct. It'd be 40 pounds. So he must be getting one of those water jugs that are you put on top of a fountain. But I think we were referring to a milk jug. 2 milk jugs would be 8 pounds. That's correct.
Well, you and I are wimpy little guys.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, let me tell you what, 8 pounds, you can get a workout of 8 pounds.
You can. That was the point I was trying to make. You start getting the smaller weights and you get to the high reps, you can get a burn. Now, there's more discussion about, well, doc, you can't build muscle mass with it. I get that. I understand that. That's not what we were talking about. The Bale-Deneen book discusses genetic testing, 4 different genotypes related to cardiovascular health. Would you recommend this type of testing? Would it make a difference knowing these? Well, again, the fellow that started the lab, the major lab that was available to do that specific Bale-Deneen genetic testing, cardiogenetics, is with us on the channel. So any comments, James?
I think you absolutely should, as you often order for your patients. I think it is good. Knowing your ApoE has a significant impact on your lifestyle choices, particularly for dementia or vascular disease. Your PCSK9 and your KIF6, again, impact your increased risk. He also talks in that book, he was very early in capturing haptoglobin. And for those who are diabetic, and I suspect insulin resistance, understanding your haptoglobin type, whether you're a 1-1, 2-2, or 2-1, significantly impacts your choice, particularly supplementation with vitamin E. That, vitamin E in high doses is not necessarily recommended, but if you have a haptoglobin 2-2 variant, you are really 500% increased risk of heart attack or stroke if you have diabetes. So there are, as you can read through the book, it does make a difference in your lifestyle. And for folks who are ApoE 4 plus maybe an MTHFR variant, there's 3 or 4 of those, and some people click them all, and they get them all, and that means you're really a walking target for heart disease, and that does impact how serious I think most people would take the challenge of staying heart healthy. So I recommend it. And I have no economic impact anymore. That lab's been sold, so I no longer benefit financially, but obviously believe in it.
To that point, as James said, I've done a lot of cardiogenetic testing for my patients. I don't come out of the blocks recommending it like I used to, because with the YouTube, in the past, the service used to be $3,000 to $5,000 in order to get it down to less than $1,000, and some of the other numbers that you've seen, a $99 per month rate, some of those things. We had to back up and just acknowledge the fact that genetics may load the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger. So focus and educate people about that, and then get that not so much as a standard screening test, but a test if there's specific need. Robert Weiss, yep, 1 pound gallon, 8 pounds. Compound, Steve Mitchum, compound exercises, multiple joints, bench press, pull-ups, pull-downs, squats, dips, and if your knees or back are good, you can use good form. Medium weight deadlifts, but probably not for seniors. Anita Herman. Oh, and Steve's coming in from Facebook. That's good to know. Thank you for the comment. Thank you for making us aware. Thank you from Anita Herman. The Shumby, but does melatonin help? It helps with a lot of people. There's no question about it. By far the biggest issue is sleep hygiene. When John was on the channel, he did a lot of work helping people, listing the specific components of sleep hygiene. It doesn't include watching YouTube videos until midnight, by the way. DCAP, my A1C is 5.9 to 6.1 since 2004. My postprandial can go up to 250 once in a while for the past 10 to 15 years. I'm very thin, vegetarian. Fasting sugar is always below 110. Now I have SIBO. Well, I would also say, D, even though your A1C is 5.9 or to 6.1, and your doc may be saying, well, you've got a touch of sugar, you've got prediabetes. If your postprandial is going up to 250, you've got full-blown diabetes. Either way, you're getting damage to your arteries outside of the SIBO. Attending wouldn't start me on any meds. Advice: see another attending. I would consider, obviously, my patients that have full-blown diabetes, most of them are able to keep their blood sugars below 120 on diet and lifestyle alone. But most of them do continue to do elect to go ahead and take metformin. I feel very strongly that metformin should not be a prescription level drug anymore. Won't go down that bunny hole, but you can call Michelle at our group, and we'd be happy to give you some other options. Barbara,
pardon me if I interrupted. You might want to make a comment with the and being a vegetarian and getting a post of 250 is, we've talked about this before, is many people who are vegetarian are very we lots of friends, lots of relatives that do that. But vegetarian alone doesn't protect you against these high blood sugars. So look at your diet. Look at the fruits, particularly the fruits, and what kind of fruits are they eating, and what's causing, how often is that happening? Because you might want to reconsider some of the diet choices you're having that have even what people would call natural sugar can still spike, create that spike.
Well, in fact, when you start looking at it, the biggest burden for carbs tends to come from grain products. Mm-hmm. And so what people say, well, no, I'm eating whole wheat bread. Look at the glycemic. James mentioned the glycemic value of foods. Look at the glycemic value of whole wheat bread and this white bread that everybody thinks is so terrible. White bread is what, in the mid 70s, and whole wheat is 67. Both of them, in case you don't have any comparable numbers, those are terrible glycemic numbers. And grain products are basically what they call complex carbohydrates. Those are one sugar molecule attached to another, to another in a very long chain. So instead of getting single individual sugar molecules, you're getting a large chain of them, and it only takes your body seconds to minutes to digest those and turn them into sugar.
Later, Dee comes back and says she's considering eating chicken. And again, I'm not a dietitian, but if you don't have a particular conscious reason that you're vegetarian or history, as many of our listeners do from different parts of the world, then you might want to consider salmon instead of chicken. In my own experience, I find that Ford and I are both the Southern boys, so this is almost sacrilegious for us to put down chicken, but you might want to consider natural caught salmon. Try introducing that. It keeps me satisfied, and that's when I turn more to salmon, I actually do much better on the keto diet on fish, particularly salmon, than I do off of chicken. Chicken's high in protein and still has some challenge you can talk about.
Well, you didn't mention my new keto Southern fried chicken.
That's right. I haven't made that yet. I haven't gotten to the kitchen and made panko. No, it wasn't panko. It was
panko.
Yeah, it was panko, but it was crunching up pork rinds.
Right.
And there may be people all over the country right now that are gasping in horror at the thought.
I'm sure there are, but it's a no carb food, and if you're from the South and a big Southern fried chicken fan, think about it.
Well,
Bart and Chuck going back and forth about those weights again. Yeah, 40 pounds of water in a thing swinging around is going to feel a little bit more uncontrolled than a dumbbell. Mm. Mentioned sleep apnea and its effects. Yeah, as we mentioned before, sleep can cause very significant problems, and they equate sleep apnea to coming close to death. I think that's a little bit over dramatic, but because you find kids, infants that die sudden infant death, but you don't tend to find so many adults that die from that. But it's a big deal. It results in significant increase in cortisol and a significant decrease in replenishment of other endocrine hormones. Thank you, Dee. And we're just about to finish up here. Off for a meeting. We'll binge watch your videos. So glad I found you. Thank you, Josefina. Yep, reconsidering the chicken. Okay. Dr. Brewer, what is your opinion of the glucosamine chondroitin study that showed the heart health improvement? Not familiar with that study, Mr. Tier.
Send it to the link, so we'd love to look at it.
Yeah, if you'd send it, Jeff. Pete Liness, good morning, Dr. Brewer. When is your book due to be published? Oh, I made the rash mistake of saying it was coming out in a month or so this past November. I keep thinking it's going to be another month or so, but I've got a co-author and I won't get into it. I hope it's a month or so. Mezzanine, was a vegetarian distance runner for decades. I was plant-based distance runner for decades. Didn't prevent an elevated calcium score. Nope, didn't for me either. Didn't prevent me going on developing high blood pressure. Didn't prevent me from aging. Didn't prevent me from getting insulin resistant. And in some ways, according to some criteria, you could even say I'm full-blown diabetic. Cereal, bananas, skim milk, and OJ replaced by eggs. Yep, major difference in terms of carbs there. Right. And most people, in fact, just about everybody used to think cereal, bananas, skim milk, and OJ were a great breakfast.
And oatmeal.
You know, I still get a lot of people pushing back on oatmeal, and you know what we'll say is, okay, go ahead and eat your oatmeal, but do a glucose test half an hour after you eat that oatmeal. Good question, Jeff. Okay, thank you so much for your interest today. We went on a little bit further, longer. It was a relatively small audience. We went up to about 80, but a very intense audience. A lot of folks with a lot of knowledge about diabetes and prediabetes. We appreciate it.
Ford, real quick comment for those still listening. They've heard us drop the hints. We will be opening a clinic soon. One hard brick and mortar clinic will be opening up in South Alabama, in the Fairhope, Foley, Alabama area. So anyone that has family, friends down there that want more information, that will be coming out soon, and we'll be looking at other locations to create prevention-minded, clinics. We've been doing a lot digitally through the COVID, but the time has come to start building a new type of medicine. Put your money where our mouth is, Ford. That's what we're doing. So be looking for updates for that, and probably not Tupelo, Mississippi. If you can get the beach up there a little bit closer, Aunt Martha, we may consider more. But Ford and I worked out of Pensacola, had clinics down there, and we joke. We said our wives have decided that we maybe need to go back to the coast and open some more clinics back up. Get out of their hair.
And if there's no Lower Alabama in your future, we still have, we've got patients in New Zealand, Australia, Brazil,
Europe,
Singapore, Europe, and obviously 40 something states here. So there are ways to get good care.
Right.
Thank you very much. Talk to you later.
Great job.